Okay, thank you very much, Evelina. Let me just call up my slides. I'm hoping that you can see my slides there. Does that work?
Dave, yeah, we can see them and we can
You
hear
can
you.
see them and
So,
you can hear me. Okay,
yes.
excellent. All right. So many thanks for inviting me along today again, following our get together in LTRC in Montreal. My role as discussant is to try and pull together some threads and see to what extent we can tell a coherent narrative based on this incredibly important area of navigating inclusivity. What have we heard? What have we learned? Where can we go from here? Let me just, oh, how can I move on my slide? There we go. Let me just remind ourselves of the four papers we've had. You've got the title slides there, one from Nahal Habasbaji, one from Carla Pastorina Campos and Amy Devine, one from Janine Metallic and Beverly Baker, and the last one from Gemma Bellhouse. And they all focused on slightly different aspects of the topic of interest. So if I was to pull out the main focus for each paper, then I would say the first one, consider the introduction of different types of representative materials in tests, while Carla and Amy went on to look at some of the constraints and the barriers that typically impact on representation in international English language tests. They constrained themselves to that. Janine and Beverly narrowed the focus to explore considerations that emerge when trying to incorporate Indigenous topics into testing materials. And again, their context was very specific for higher education institutions. And Gemma took a slightly different angle and looked at the examination or examined the considerations that apply when working with younger learners and trying to create EDI compliant content. Struggling to put my slides on a bit more. There we go. But let's drill down a little bit and look at some specific insights that I think emerge from the four papers. I think Nahal highlighted for us the multiple facets of representation and emphasized that they don't stand in isolation. They're actually quite highly interactive and can be intersecting. So this is not a simple process of trying to tease out a single facet and deal with it. In fact, it's far more complex than that. She also highlighted some emerging concepts, and I'll come back to the notion of conceptualization a little later. Some of the vocabulary that she used were words like, distinguishing between reflection and representation, visibility, dominance, and some of the other terms that she introduced us to. And she also highlighted the fact that representation and power or agency are very closely aligned. Carla and Amy focused on what research or what some research can tell us and highlighted two illustrative examples, the examples of global Englishes and non-heteronormative families, as almost case study examples of how it might be possible to reflect on and think about the issues and challenges involved in a more practical and applied way. And I think they also usefully highlighted the notion of thinking in terms of differing levels of challenge. Some things are easier, perhaps, to respond to or address. Some issues are much more difficult and require a longer time frame or a greater level of engagement and investment. Janine and Beverly really cautioned us very appropriately, I think, about the risk of misrepresentation and how good intentions, however worthy they may be, however honorable, however enthusiastic, don't necessarily translate to responsible practice. And it becomes very important to engage with representatives of a community whom you are seeking to give voice to, if you are going to go beyond good intentions and achieve responsible practice. And they introduced the notion for me of relational accountability. And then also the very practical value of having tools to work with that are shared and will help achieve the goals. And then Gemma, I think, really helpfully highlighted how sometimes an existing policy or set of procedures or guidelines can be extended. It isn't necessary always to start from a blank sheet of paper or to start from scratch. So it may be possible to extend or expand existing policy and practice to a new domain. And again, this is part and parcel of developing practical tools which can be used to support literacy among content creators. If I were to pull out the recurring themes across the 4 papers, then I would classify them in the following way. There are some themes that link to the issue of conceptualization, how we think and talk about issues of representation or representativity in our assessments. I think there's another bundle of issues that relate to questions relating to power and agency. Who has it? Who doesn't? Is it shared? Which leads quite naturally on to the question of relationality. How do we achieve engagement and positive relational accountability within the business, the complex business of seeking representation or a fair and fuller representation in our tests. And then, of course, ultimately, it all comes down to what we can do in practice. So let's start with the question of conceptualization. One of the things that I appreciate about Nahal's paper is some of the key concepts and terms that she has introduced or reported from other literature, which allow us to have a discourse or a phraseology to work with when trying to talk about some of these challenges. Issues such as visibility and dominance, normativity, invisibility and erasure, and the question of safe inclusion. But Carla and Amy's paper also helps us to conceptualize the challenges in terms of something like levels of challenge relating to cost or market, and there are others that we could pull out. Janine and Beverly highlight very importantly for us the emotional challenge, I think, in some respects, of seeking to avoid misrepresentation as a result of poor understanding or lack of understanding or misguided efforts. And Gemma's paper also talks about the need for new knowledge to be developed and expertise for a new domain. We cannot necessarily simply take a policy for one context and apply it without critique or refinement in another context. And I think in the chat I saw that several people were interested in the checklists, which have been developed within specific contexts to help conceptualize and operationalize representation or better representation in assessment, but which are not necessarily transferable in their entirety. And I think conceptualization becomes a really important part of the thinking about and the acting out of attempts to represent more faithfully the world as it is, rather than just a world that is informed by our own personal view or worldview or set of beliefs. So the 4 papers all inform how we can better conceptualize and problematize issues of representation in language assessment. And I'll come back to the question that we might ask ourselves later. Moving on to this recurring theme of distribution and direction of power and agency, Nahal highlighted the importance of asking questions about whose voices, whose realities, whose ideologies and identities are being represented or not represented, ignored, who is privileged and who is unseen, and why is that happening, and what is the impact? Carla and Amy introduced us to the different power dynamics that can be at work, resulting from the different stakeholder perspectives. So the testing industry, the marketplace, the socio-cultural context, all have a part to play in shaping how power and agency are distributed or directed, how they are aligned or non-aligned, how they are assigned to certain agents but not to others. And I think Janine and Beverly really, again, allowed us to think of the importance of adopting a more critical and reflective mindset. And there was an interesting little discussion to which I contributed in the chat about, whether certain methodologies actually are neutral, as we might have always thought them to be, or whether they are actually embedded within a cultural or an ontological or an epistemological mindset, and therefore whether they are actually the best tool to be using for a critical reflection, or whether there are other ways of knowing. And if I've learned anything from engaging with scholars who are working on tests for Indigenous communities of all sites, and I appreciate I'm using that in an overgeneralized way, it is that we need to hear how narrow our own way of knowing is, and how much richer it could be if we work together collaboratively. So the recurring theme of the distribution of power and agency that weaves through the 4 papers, I think, informs how we can better understand the complex dynamics and impact of power and agency in this area. The third one is relationality or attitudinal stance, and in a sense, these 4 recurring themes sort of blend into one another to some extent. We need to think about and self-critique on our own attitudes to safe zone representation, and ask ourselves questions about the extent to which we are condoning or promoting an artificial sense of inclusion. Introducing unfamiliar content or content from other cultures, multicultural content, can risk a negative impact on learner and test taker identity and belonging. And that's something we need to take seriously, because one of the things that I have learned to a limited degree in my own experience is that if test takers can see themselves in tests, in test content, if they can hear their voices, then in fact there is some evidence that the level of motivation and engagement with the material, with the content, goes up. So it is in the interests of the test-taking population and the learning population potentially to make a representation a more central focus for tests for different communities and for different purposes. And I think thought leadership for internal and external influencing becomes very important, along with research, as Safina, I think, pointed out in her comment. Relational accountability, I've already talked about a little bit, the attention to roles and power within a partnership. It's got to be intentional, it's got to be collaborative, it's got to be dialogic. And it takes quite a lot of extra work to be able to do this. It takes time, it takes building relationships. But in the long term, it is worth it, because there is a much greater investment and engagement with the assessment. And where we engage with different ways of knowing, where we resist the temptation to be patronizing on the basis of our own worldview or our own experience, we actually achieve much better outcomes for our test takers and our test stakeholders more broadly. And then finally, trying to operationalize all of this through developing practical approaches and tools. Nahal, I've already mentioned, offers us a way into developing a common language or a discourse. The way in which Carla and Amy developed concrete exemplification through case studies, as well as a potential conceptual framework for grading the level of challenge, I think could be very valuable. And both Janine and Beverly's paper and also Gemma's paper highlight how we can develop practical tools which can be used to support literacy among content creators, although always with the proviso that they are suitably adapted for the context in which they are applied. So the discussion here informs how we can develop useful practical approaches and tools and share good practice more widely. There is a strong interaction between all of these themes, and they are not sequential in the way that perhaps I presented them today. And they also provide some questions for us to think about in our own specific contexts. So in terms of conceptualization, how could we improve the way we conceptualize and problematize issues of representation in our L2 assessment? And these are questions for us to go away and think about in our own context, for our own purposes. How could we identify who needs to be actively involved in decision making so as to ensure greater representation in our L2 assessment? What is the best way of establishing good relational accountability and managing positive partnerships to promote better representation in our L2 assessment? And what sorts of practical tools, hands-on tools, do we need more of to help ensure greater representation in our assessment practices? So my task has been to share some reflections on what they suggest about how we might navigate inclusivity, to identify contributions that help us to understand and problematize the notion, and to highlight practical actions that can help promote greater representation of human and cultural diversity in the L2 assessments. And I think we could subdivide again both of these into, or all four of these areas, a recurring theme, into a conceptual side, a framework for helping us think about issues of representation, and a practical methodology, relationality and practical action, for helping us operationalize. And those are things that are going to help us work towards best practice and principled implementation as far as assessment representation is concerned. I'll stop there.
Lynda, thank you very, very much. It is always good to leave us with challenging and insightful questions, as you've done, challenging our own perceptions and our own practice in this area. So thank you very much for this.